Now, I kind of want to apply the same questions plus a few others maybe to the state of workplace violence in schools,
Sure.
referencing a study released in March of this year by, I think it was the American Psychological Association, yeah, APA. They found that during the pandemic, rates of violence and aggression against K-12 school personnel were high as well. And it specifically found that I think it's nearly half of teachers surveyed said they plan to quit or transfer their jobs due to their concerns about school climate and safety. And you said Ontic's report touches all different realms, but how do you describe the current state of workplace violence in schools?
Well, I'll tell you that we are seeing the same thing. We through Ontic do behavioral threat assessment training for K-12 schools in statewide initiatives around the country, but for thousands of personnel within Texas and North Carolina, Vermont, Arkansas, a number of states that we provide statewide training under federal grants that those states have gotten for around school safety issues, including school behavioral threat assessment. The great teacher exodus is still ongoing. A lot of teaching personnel quit their positions, and then the challenge was because of different reasons. They didn't want to go back in the classroom. They had family concerns. They weren't able to navigate life back in the classroom. But also because of threats and violence that they had experienced and were experiencing now that people were back in school. A lot of that was fueled by debate over masking and masking requirements. And as those requirements have also receded, that we have seen a reduction in some threatening behavior that schools and school employees are facing. That being said, schools are absolutely facing similar dynamic to what we just talked about with healthcare personnel, in that there has been a lot of turnover. So for some, it was, the great resignation. For others, it was sort of the great migration or switching around, that there's been sort of, they may have quit one school, but stayed in education and gone to a different school. For a number of educators, just simply a change of scenery has been helpful. So they've stayed in education, but that's meant for any one school or district, there's still a fair amount of turnover. And we work with so many schools around the country that still are understaffed because they haven't gotten back up to full staffing with people quitting during the pandemic. All of that leads to a stressful work environment. And so all of that leads to not only threats they may be getting from students, but from parents. And again, there is that employee versus employee disagreement becomes combative behavior. But for school employees, the biggest concern typically is threats that may come from students, but also with masking requirements and school board division and divisive topics has come from parents as well.
It's funny because schools and hospitals, are vastly different in what they provide, right? One educates and one helps you with your health. But a lot of the times the answers, like you said, to preventing violence are the same, largely behavioral threat assessment teams and identifying concerning behaviors before it escalates. So
absolutely. And I want to emphasize that, because what the Joint Commission requirements have put in place for healthcare, we have actually seen recommended for K-12 schools and for colleges and universities for quite some time, through the National Threat Assessment Center at the Secret Service, which has some great resources, and I can share those with you, through cabinet level agencies, through state task forces, through professional associations. This recommendation for school violence prevention and college and university violence prevention includes the same major components. So having a multidisciplinary team, getting training in behavioral threat assessment and management, having a policy that says, hey, we are committed to a violence-free school, including a violence-free workplace. And for schools and for colleges and universities, it's really important to keep in mind that they are not just places of education, but they are places of employment as well. And so they have to think about, how do we keep this place safe for our employees, as well as for our students and for parents who are coming here. But training, policies, multidisciplinary team, having a way to a database, a software platform to keep track of incidents and track where you are in those incidents is absolutely vital.
Which is why annual security reports at colleges now are so great to have. And again, going back to the safe schools, not safe schools, just encouraging prospective students or parents who are looking for kids to go to school, don't take that at face values, looking at these numbers, and do your research a little bit deeper.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions that parents and applicants can ask as they're looking at as they're applying to college, for example. Look at that annual security report. So many people didn't even know it exists, but every college and university has to create and make public an annual security report that documents the amount of incidents they had in the past year around sort of major categories of criminal behavior. But they also have to document all of the different programs and policies and procedures they have in place to keep their college or university safe. And it is a great resource for information on, do they have a behavioral threat assessment team? What does their Title IX office and resources look like? What policies do they have in place to address harassment, hazing, bullying, things like that? So it's a great resource for parents of students there or parents of applicants. And you can certainly ask questions on tours of issues of security. And one thing I'm seeing I find fascinating, that high school students and college students, undergraduates these days, they're savvy consumers of security information. And I think in large part because they have grown up in this Columbine and post-Columbine era. They have grown up with active shooter drills and lockdown and knowing about school shootings and hearing about them on the news. And we now see students coming into colleges and universities for the first time asking, well, who do I report a threat to? What active shooter training procedures do we have in place? Are we going to do a lockdown drill? Asking for that information because they are used to having it and they need to know what to do in certain situations. So it's fascinating to see, especially from the student perspective, the level of knowledge they are bringing into educational settings. But as I would encourage any student who's looking to apply to a college or university and are interested in what sort of safety track record they have, pull up those annual security reports because they're a great resource.
Yeah, I think back to, I graduated college in 2011, and I don't remember any of this, and it's because I kind of just missed the generation of emphasizing the safety early on, and then that's the generation now going to college that are carrying those lessons that they've learned when they were young into when they're older. And it's unfortunate that it has come to that, but at least kids are more prepared now for if something is to occur.
And it is a real sign of culture change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be fascinating to see where those students now go on to leadership positions, and I could see them actively promoting a culture of safety wherever they end up working.
Absolutely. And now we're talking overall violence in general, but there has been an increase in active shooter events in schools as well, not necessarily random shootings, but targeted violence, kids bringing guns into school with issues that they have with classmates outside of the classroom. Is there typically a correlation in workplace violence increasing or school violence increasing when there's more violence in the nation as a whole?
So that correlation is really hard to draw just because a number of reasons. One, because the definition of mass shooting continues to change. So you have active shooter events versus mass shooter events. Active shooter means it's something in progress. Mass shooting is typically 4 or more victims by the same shooter, but it could be in one location. It could be over the course of a day in a dispersed geographic area. So the data are kind of all over the map on that, and it's hard to draw that correlation. What I will tell you is that what we typically see is anytime there is a high profile mass shooting event or high profile active shooter event, but something that garners the news, that we typically see an increase in threat reports that come in within that same sector. So if there's a high profile school shooting, we see schools across the country have a blip in school threats that come in. And it could be from a number of reasons. It could be because people are looking at this and seeing, well, this is someone who was looking to violence for a solution, and I am at the end of my rope and don't see anything else. And so in sort of a copycat effect. That copycat effect is not strong, but that it can happen. Oftentimes we see the blip or the increase in threats coming forward because people are now reporting things they've been aware of for a while and they hadn't, but this news item in a different part of the country made them think, I better bring this forward. So that's more the likely that sort of the real reason behind we see those increase. So that wherever something occurs now within that sector, we tend to see an increase in threats impacting other institutions, schools, colleges, and universities in that sector as well.
And now this may be a similar response to the healthcare question, but maybe a little bit different due to the makeup of a school population versus healthcare. But what steps should a school employee take when they are confronted with a combative person in the workplace? And what are some effective ways, again, to help de-escalate the concerning behavior?
Yeah, so again, de-escalation training is a great tool, and lots of different organizations provide de-escalation training. And we can even look at that jointcommissions.org. I think there are some free videos on there about how to de-escalate. I think what's really important is to keep in mind in a hostile encounter, again, if you are alone with a person trying to then get to where they need to be, get to a place where there are more people around. It's just always safer to be in place with other folks around. But that you don't have to solve the problem in the moment, and absolutely don't have to prove that you are right in the moment. If you can find a way just to listen, take some notes if you can, to just listen and say, look, the more I know, the more I may be able to help, but tell me the full story. Listening tends to be helpful in de-escalating. Now, I'm not saying put yourself in harm's way in order to listen. If someone starts to become physically assaultive, try to get away from the situation as quickly as possible. However, in those school board meetings, parent-teacher classrooms, confrontation with a student, with a fellow employee, that those are just some tips to de-escalate. And there, as I said, there are other good free resources out there for de-escalation. But most importantly, if there is some sort of threat or there has been some hostile encounter, then to be able to report that to the threat assessment team. And it might be a threat assessment team within that school. It might be at the district level. And if there isn't one, then to report it to local law enforcement so they have a way to keep track of it.
Can you point to think of any specific resources for violence prevention in schools?
Yeah, some great resources. So I'll see if I can pull it up. But the National Threat Assessment Center within the U.S. Secret Service has done extensive research on school violence, especially targeted school violence. And they have got some great free resources and free training. So let me see if I've got quickly. So schools and districts can request their free training through the local Secret Service field office. And then I've got a great guide here, which is a great place to start, that they came out with a National Threat Assessment Center published a couple of years ago, called Enhancing School Safety Using a Threat Assessment Model. And it is a great guide because it is very easy to read. It is a quick read. It is sort of 8 steps on how to build an effective targeted violence prevention program for schools, school shooting prevention for schools. So you can quickly go through and say, do we have this? Do we need it? Do we have it at the district level, at the school level? Do we have the right training? And it really helps provide a great, easy to access framework for how to build an effective program and run it well.
Thank you. And for healthcare, we also spoke about technology tools out there. Are you seeing that teachers are using similar tools, different tools?
There are a whole host of tools in the K-12 space and in colleges and universities. I will tell you, within those sectors especially, those tools have become big business. So what I would recommend is that, for K-12 schools and colleges and universities, do your research on what software availability there is to track incidents and to follow a defensible behavioral threat assessment process. And I want to emphasize that there are a lot of software vendors out there right now, especially in K-12, saying, hey, here's our threat assessment software. They don't have expertise that went into the development of their workflow. You can use their software, but you may not be doing it the right way. So make sure the team has training on behavioral threat assessment, whoever's going to be using that software to track incidents, and then really ask some tough questions about what went into the workflows they have built in. The bottom line is there should not be, software should not be making any assessments for you. There should be no artificial intelligence. There is no good credible data saying that an artificial intelligence decision on threat assessment is helpful or accurate in any way. We still need the team to be making the decision. The software can help make sure they follow all the right steps and help document their work and help document what information they've gathered.
And another repetitive question, but for schools, what are some must-have schools should include in policies and procedures for violence prevention?
So that NTAC guide I gave you it really has it all laid out in terms of they've got 8 elements there, but the top ones for me are having some sort of policy saying that we're, as a school, as a district, we're committed to a violence-free district, violence-free school. But it can be really simple. The Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety has some great free resources in terms of policy samples and templates that you can use. It's just one option. But state school safety centers generally may have that. Having a multidisciplinary team, whether it supports the whole district, one team per high school, one team per school. There are lots of different ways you can set it up, but having at least a multidisciplinary team and training in behavioral threat assessment. So you're repeating the question, I'm repeating the answer, but these really are the top things for violence prevention in all of these different sectors. And then, as we talked about before, having some database, some way to capture all these incidents, and ideally follow a threat assessment workflow along the way.
We know a lot of schools have limited budgets, right? And so do you have any recommendations for schools who are looking to mitigate workplace violence, but maybe they're finding that their district isn't focusing on it? And obviously free resources like the one you mentioned, the Secret Service one, is an example. Can you think of any other ways?
I would say check with your state school safety center. So many states have stood up school safety centers. So there's the Texas School Safety Center is a great model for this, as is Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety. Most states now have some sort of entity that is there to provide a resource for schools within their state with free policy, with free training, with sample procedures to follow, and in some states, the states themselves are purchasing the software at a state level to allow schools within that state, at least public schools, to be able to access the software and use it to track their cases and that level. So those are sort of the must-haves, but also typically free resources. One thing to keep in mind is that the federal government, through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, has been providing grants called the Stop School Violence Grants, and STOP is all caps, STOP. Stop School Violence Grants that have provided a lot of funding to states and to individual districts to support school safety efforts. That funding is still available. I don't know when the next call for applications is, but that's a great funding mechanism. But I would highly recommend checking to see at a state level, what is the school safety center at that state? What are they doing? What are they providing? And what can schools and employees individually access?
And now ending our entire discussion the same way we did about the healthcare one, do you have predictions for 2023 related to violence in schools, and also any promising or hopeful information out there?
Yeah, prediction. My prediction for violence in schools is that we're actually going to see a decrease because we are getting back to much more normal conditions. Healthcare, I think, is still under siege, in part because they are facing an ongoing, this sort of triple-demic, an ongoing influx of patients. My belief is that with schools really implementing this behavioral threat assessment, and again, we're sort of finally seeing the benefits of a couple of years of work because of all the federal funding, because so many states now are really trying to implement behavioral threat assessment and violence prevention at a state level, whether it's for looking at concerns coming from students, concerns coming about employee behavior, whatever the case may be. It is we're finally helping to see the benefits, we're finally seeing the benefits of all of this infrastructure that's been built at a state level and for schools around the country at a way we have never seen before historically at all. So it is my truly optimistic view that we're going to start to see targeted school violence incidents start to decrease. And we're going to hear much more about the wins that schools are having, the averted attacks. So much of what we do to prevent violence centers around how to support someone who's struggling, whether it is a patient family member, a student, an employee. that so much of what we can do when we find someone who is considering resorting to violence, feels like they have to resort to violence, feels like they are at the end of their rope and have no other options left, the more we can do to actually support that person and help them solve those underlying problems, the more violence we can prevent. So the more schools and districts understand that and are able to really put that mindset and that behavioral threat assessment training into practice, we will start to hear a lot more about those incidents that didn't occur, the saves they had, the wins they had, and I really believe we're going to start to see a decrease in violence.
That's good to hear. I mean, healing from the effects of a pandemic is going to take time, but we're obviously putting some great infrastructures into place to help that. So
yeah, and people typically are resilient.
Yep.
So given time, we're able to bounce back. I actually think, having gone through the pandemic, the students we're seeing in schools now, in schools and in colleges, are going to become an incredibly resilient generation going forward.
And speak up for what they need, right?
Yes, absolutely.